Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Generation Cult, a show about people who grew up in controlling groups and what happened to them after they left. I'm Dhyana, and this is the second episode of Season 4. Thank you so much for continuing to listen, and if you need to reach us, just send an email to generationcult@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter, or X, if that's what you want to call it. Also Facebook. You can find us at Generation Cult. And if you want to support the show, we have a Patreon page. So on this episode, we are going to meet Amanda, whose family's connection to the particular group she grew up in go back for generations. She describes it as a Pentecostal Baptist offshoot related to another group called The Message. This offshoot that she grew up in, it doesn't really have a name, but it was started by a man named Roy E. Davis during his time in Georgia. Davis was very involved in the Ku Klux Klan and the even more extreme White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. We will get into more details about the organization Amanda grew up in during the interview. Hi, Amanda. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
If you don't mind, I'd like to just jump in and talk about the history of the group you grew up in, because it gets pretty confusing. I actually kind of drew myself a little diagram, which I don't think entirely helped. So it started with Roy E. Davis. Tell me about this man. Who is he?
Okay, so Roy E. Davis was a gentleman who is very notorious because he was in the KKK in kind of the Midwest and Western United States for a long time. And he became very, even more radicalized. And so the KKK kicked him and some other people out. So they made another group called the White Knights of the KKK. And Roy Davis was the chaplain of that group and the KKK for a little while. And so he was the one who basically made it where, yes, God is a racist. God meant for people to be separated because he made us look different. He made us speak different languages. He made us have different, hair, things like that. So he was very, very adamant about those things. And that's one of the things that he taught in all of his churches. They call it planting a church. So it's where he goes, or anyone can go and start a new church and choose who they want to be the leader of that church. Roy Davis planted churches all over the country, but some of the bigger ones are in Texas and Georgia. And those just so happen to be the places where he was practicing polygamy, and he had wives who did not know about each other. They were not consenting polygamists. And so that's what he ended up going to prison for, was polygamy. And then also he tried to marry an underage girl and add to his number of wives. And he was convicted of child sexual assault, trying to marry a minor, and having multiple spouses.
So what does he have to do with your group?
So he planted the church that we became. When he was spending his time in Georgia, he had this church, and it was kind of a group of churches. The one I grew up in eventually left that group, but he ran the church and gave us very specific rules to follow. A lot of the ones that you hear about in independent fundamental Baptist groups, things like that, very strict gender roles, very patriarchal, hierarchical, where, you have God, and then you have your preacher, and then you have the man, and then you have the woman, and then you have the boy children, and then you have the girl children, very hierarchical in that way. But he also added some of the other things, like racism, and explaining to us, we were an entirely white congregation, explaining to us why we were they didn't call us the master race. They didn't go quite that far, but kind of why we were the most holy. They didn't hammer it in all the time. It was just a kind of a sometimes thing.
This was started a long time ago, but your family has been in this for a long time. So by the time you were born, your family had a long history in this. How did that happen? How did the history of your family get entrenched in this group?
So my father's family, everyone that I've ever known in my father's family was part of this group. So there is no talking about my father's family without it. right? So that I know of, my great 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 grandparents were in this group
Wow.
when it first started here, like in Georgia, in the I believe it was started in the 1940s in Georgia. And so my few greats back grandparents were in it. And then my grandfather and my father were born and raised in the group as well. And then so was I.
Okay.
And then my mother's family, they joined the group by word of mouth when they moved here from Tennessee. So they were in another Pentecostal church in Tennessee, and then they came here because of work for my grandfather, but they ended up joining this group when my mother was very, very young. So my mother and father both basically grew up in it, and then they met and married.
And so it never had a name at any point when it was started way back with this founder, and then when your grandparents and when your parents joined, like there was never any name. It was just what the church or whatever would refer to it as.
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. Because the way that Davis taught about it was that denominations were just labels. They were just a way of saying how you were different from a different group. And he would always say things like, you don't have to tell people who you are, you show them who you are. So it never really had a name
Hmm.
other than that. Like, I won't say the name of the church because it is still an active church and I don't want anybody to go and,
Yeah.
but he would always say things like, it's something that you show, you don't have to tell them. He was very adamant, along with some of the other people who he taught and mentored, like William Branham from the Message, that we were not Baptists because Baptists were becoming too mainstream, and we were not Pentecostal because they didn't like the label, they didn't like some of the ways that the Pentecostals were going and things. So if we had to label ourselves, sometimes we would call ourselves Baptists, sometimes we would call ourselves Pentecostal. Some people say independent Pentecostal Baptist. It's just kind of a hodgepodge of whatever people in the moment
Yeah.
wanted to call it.
Yeah, yeah, this is why my diagram didn't work when I tried when I tried to and yeah, and I think we should touch on the message because I did mention that earlier, and I don't know how familiar people are with that. I know more people have heard of the message than this unnamed group you're discussing. Is there a brief way to talk about that for people who haven't heard of the message? Because it is related to this group you're talking about.
Right. So the Message is the group that was started by William Branham, and he was actually mentored by Roy Davis before he started the Message and while he was getting it started. Roy Davis was an integral part of it, but ended up getting arrested and had to stop being part of the Message at that point. That's when they kind of separated. But they always had crossover and they would always speak to one another. But after Davis died, and the Message became even more popular, Branham became kind of like, he would call himself like a prophet, and he would call himself a lot of things that Davis didn't necessarily agree with. And then so the Message actually, a lot of the major cults that we think of, like infamous cults that we think of today, are influenced by the Message, and therefore were probably at some point influenced by Davis himself. Because Jim Jones from Jonestown, he worked with William Branham for a time. Or I believe it's called the Family International.
Oh, Children of God? I mean, they're called Family
Yes.
International now, but yeah, I was
Yes.
Children of God. Okay,
Um,
yeah.
the man who started that, his mother actually worked with Roy Davis and William Branham.
Oh, David Berg.
Yeah.
Okay.
His mother was a preacher and she worked with Branham and Davis. So he was influenced by them as well.
Wow.
And then, yeah. And then the one that people might know of today, they're calling it, I don't believe it's what they call themselves, but they're calling it the starvation cult in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
It's an offshoot of the Message as well.
Oh, huh. Okay. So how do people get into this group? I had never heard of it. Is it secretive or can people just join? Like, how does somebody become a part of this group? And I'm talking about the one that you specifically grew up in.
Basically, you're born into it. I mean, the churches are open. Everybody knows that they're churches. They have crosses. They have, that sort of thing. But they're usually very small churches, and they're not ones that you look at and you say, "Oh, I really want to go to that one." It's they're not very welcoming. They're not very flamboyant or pretty. They're just my grandfather, who's just recently turned 91, would always say, or still always says, it's a backwoods church. So it's like they're small, very tight knit groups that, unless you know someone, you aren't going to feel welcomed there. For example, when I was young, whenever there would be a guest at the church, the preacher would always curtail the stuff and make it very straight and narrow, and wouldn't say a lot of the more flamboyant things that were said when it was just church members. So just going and visiting, you wouldn't necessarily know. You had to be basically born in or have gone for a long time or kind of vouched for to be let in and stay.
Okay. So a lot of other people you knew in this group were all people who had these long histories that went way back
Yes.
as well. Okay. And was this all based in the same area?
So it wasn't all in Georgia. Like I said, Davis had planted churches all throughout the country, but each church was its own entity. They never made like a coalition or did anything, but they kind of knew who each other was. But Davis really, I think because, and this is just my speculation, I think because of what happened with him and the KKK, he did not like the idea of churches being bigger than just themselves and their congregations. He liked every church being its own small entity, because once you got bigger, then it gave more than just the preacher power, and he did not agree with that. He thought the preacher should be the end all be all of power in that group, and there shouldn't be anyone other than Jesus and God above him. And it was always a him.
Hmm. Yeah, let's talk about the belief system a little bit. So, it sounds like your group was pretty racist.
Yes.
Uh, let's talk a little bit about that. How was that put across? I mean, was it blatant? Was it subtle? Give me an idea of what this was like.
Usually it was very subtle. Like blatant, you would have the patriarchal beliefs, right? Like women are lesser than men. Those were very blatant, very in your face. Everybody knew about that. The racism would be very subtle. It would be things like, well, that's why we're better than them, or that's why white people started civilization, or things like that. It would always be very subtle type things, unless something big was happening. If something big was happening, then some of the racism would get a little bit more blatant as well. Like, for example, the stuff with Rodney King, when some of those things happened, we would hear a little bit more about it in the pulpit. 9/11 was when it got really, really, it was always anti Semitic, but it also became Islamophobic. And you had more than just talking down about Black people, because the church got very upset that a lot of Arab people in like census data and things like that were considered white. And they were like, no, they are not white people. We are white people, and that sort of thing.
So, where did you come into this? How did you feel at the time? Like, I imagine you're being raised in this, you're not given any other exposure. What was your relationship with these beliefs from a child through? You must have gone through some different stages of beliefs while you grew up in this.
Very much so, because my mother's father, bought a house that, when they purchased it, was kind of where everybody who worked for the company he worked for, they all lived there together. But over the years, the area began to develop and become a lot more diverse. And my grandfather never sold his property. So I grew up in a very diverse area, but my family didn't see it as diverse because it wasn't that way when they moved in. So our neighbors were Spanish speaking. We had Black neighbors. My best friend growing up was Black. And my family was aware of that,
Hmm.
and they were fine with it to a degree, but they would always make sure that she didn't feel 100% welcomed at our house, but I
Hmm.
was welcome to go over there and things like that. And I was lucky enough to be able to go to public school. A lot of the kids in the group were homeschooled, but my siblings and I were not. We were allowed to go to public school. And so I learned all about different kinds of people and things there. And so I became aware of how different our way of thinking was very, very young. And I would always question it. I would question it at home, I would question it at church, I would question it at school. And I would always get, three different answers.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really interested in this. Like, how was that dealt with? Like a child being like, but maybe, like, are we better? Or how was this even addressed?
So, the biggest example that comes to my mind is when I was in elementary school and we were learning about slavery. I asked why and how and things like that because I had never heard about it before or anything like that. And so my family kind of explained it like, well, we used to think that, or not we specifically, but people in general used to think that Black people were not people. And now we know that they're people, but they're just not the best kind of people, is how my family kind of explained it. And then at church, I had asked, and it got explained that, oh, well, no, we always knew that they were people, but we always knew that they were inferior people because we are the clean ones. We are the civil ones. We are the ones who come up with all of the great, wonderful things. They were just living in huts until we went and got them and brought them.
Oh, God. Huh.
Yeah. And at school, it was, well, imperialism and colonization.
Yeah. I mean, you must have been getting, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure what you were being taught at your school, if it was completely different or not. But I assume you're getting a somewhat different message at school.
Well, I mean, it was a school in Georgia, so it wasn't great.
Yeah.
Like they still don't teach that slavery was one of the reasons for the Civil War here. So it was subtle. I had some teachers of color and they were able to be like, all right, look, I understand that you're growing up in this, but like, I'm not that bad, right? So they handled it as delicately as they could.
That's a great way to do it. You meet the actual people and you're like, wait a second, this person's like a perfectly
Yeah.
intelligent, like good person. Like
This
a
person is a
person.
person,
Yeah, exactly. This is just another
right? Like,
person. Yeah.
yeah. And like, I was learning alongside of all of the things I was learning at school that I was supposed to be better than a lot of these people. And I'm sitting there going, well, she is smarter than me and he is stronger and faster and he is this way and she is that. And I'm like, we're just different. We're not better or worse or anything. It really came to a head once I started dating because until the man that I am currently married to, I didn't date white people.
Okay. Your family must have.
I was usually very, very secretive about it. They had,
Oh.
for the most part, no idea. Part of the reason I did it was curiosity of what other people were like and things like that. But another reason was that I never felt safe with white men because white men were the sources of so much of my trauma. And so I never felt safe with them for the most part because I had all sorts of traumas. I had the spiritual trauma at church, I had physical abuse, sexual abuse, and all of those were at the hands of white men. So they never felt like a safe group to me. So when I started dating, I was like, well, maybe these other people are that they're trying to keep me away from for some reason might be safer. And when they found out about that, they were not happy. I got called a race traitor. I got called possessed. I got called whore, even though I had never slept with anyone. We were just going on dates
Terrible.
and things like that. Yeah, it
awful.
got pretty bad.
And about how old were you?
That was in late middle school, early high school.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'm so sorry. I mean, I assume you were still religious and still going to
Yes.
church. So this must have, I mean, how confused were you at this time?
By the time I was in middle school, I was extremely devout. I had been born again. I had been baptized multiple times, born again, baptized, and I was very adamant about my belief in God and Jesus. I was not as convinced about some of the other teachings of that group. So it was always very hard for me to explain. Because in the South, people just invite you to their churches. Like it's like, hi, how are you? Come to my church, right? It's still that way today to a degree. But back in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was even more so. And so I would take them up on the offer and I'd be like, yes, I would love to come to your church. And then they would wonder why I didn't invite them to mine. And I would always be like, well, it's just a small little country church. You're not going to get anything out of it. No, you don't worry about it. And so that's kind of how I was able to see what other Christians were like. Was through like, well, Mom, they invited me to church. I have to go with them. Being polite, putting it in the guise of politeness. So I eventually kind of started moving away personally from a lot of those racist beliefs, but I still held very strongly to the political, like the conservative political, the patriarchal beliefs and that sort of thing for a while.
I did want to ask you about the political aspect of it. So yeah, where does this QAnon stuff come in? Because when we talked earlier, you said that this was nothing new to you. Like you had been hearing about this since you were a kid. What about the stuff we've been hearing about recently was familiar to you, and why was that in your church?
So one of the things that I've always found very interesting about QAnon is the belief in reptilian people. If you look at the history of it, most people will put it back to this one guy in England in like the 70s and how he was a conspiracy theorist and he brought up how these alien reptilian people. But there's actually a religious version of it that we learned growing up that goes back to the 1800s. And it goes back to something called British Israelism. It's a whole thing. You can look it up. It's fascinating. But one of the tenets of the British Israelism was that British people, or white people in general, European people, were the new Israelites. So they are the people who God chose. And you know that we are the chosen people. I say we, but you know white people are the chosen people because they look a certain way, they behave a certain way, things like that. Now, one of the things that they taught and that was taught in the church that I grew up in and in a lot of William Branham's churches is what they call the 2-seed doctrine or the double seed doctrine. It depends on who you ask. And that is where the religious reptilian people come from. That doctrine says that when Eve broke the covenant with God, the way that she did that was not actually eating a fruit. It wasn't eating an apple or a fig or whatever. It was by having sex with Satan as a serpent and becoming pregnant with Cain. And then that is the first child born, is this serpent seed, right? So that's where the name serpent seed doctrine comes from.
So what did you see then recently from all of this that you had in your upbringing coming into the mainstream? What's familiar?
Yes. So talking about there being different kinds of people, the reptilian people are hiding and they're just waiting for us to let our guards down, that sort of thing. The militantism of it is very, very familiar because huge parts of my family are in military ranks. And one of the things you see when you examine the military is that you have officers and you have the rank and file. And a lot of the officers, they're related to each other. They're families. They know each other. A lot of times it's a good old boys club. And a lot of those people, their children become officers after they retire. So you see when those people, when they leave, or there are some people who are dishonorably discharged and things like that, they want to go and still fight. So a lot of this like militia idea and a lot of this distrust of government and that sort of thing is very much built into this religion, but it's also very much built into the military now. And you see it in a lot of these organizations like the Proud Boys or, alt-right groups where they want to have militia and military backgrounds and they want to be these fighters. And I very much grew up in that, where everybody is a warrior for God. And the way that women are warriors for God is by giving birth to as many white babies as they possibly can. So in my family, we were all girls, but there are a lot of us. And that was one of the things, was that we were always told that that was our job, was to grow up, marry a righteous man, and have as many babies as we possibly can. I got asked a lot if I was a Mormon growing up.
Oh, because of how you dressed?
Because of how I dressed, but also because of the size of my family.
How many siblings do you have?
So I have 7 siblings.
Wow.
All girls.
That's a lot of siblings.
Yeah. And so my dad was trying for that boy with my mom and then later with my stepmom. But they very much militarized everyone, even the women. And one of the things is they use a quote from the Bible about keeping your quiver full for God. And that's why it's called the quiver full movement. Most people are familiar with it when it comes to like the Duggars.
Yeah, I've heard of the quiver full movement and of course the Duggars.
Yes. And so a lot of the independent fundamental Baptists, which is what the Duggars are, also overlaps with this group as well. They go to a lot of the same circles and conventions and things like that. But in a lot of these groups and the things that they have, that's one of the things that they teach is that militantism, and that there has to be a hierarchy for God and how that hierarchy works and who's in charge. And it gets very scary sometimes, especially if you want to step out of line.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the control must have been off the charts. I assume you must have rebelled at a certain point. What happens if someone doesn't play by the rules in this group? I can't imagine it was dealt with nicely or delicately.
No, it generally not. So I very much was all in for the religion aspect of it for my whole life, up until I got excommunicated. So from the time I was born until I was 16, 17, I was very devout. And around that age is when a few things started happening. The first thing was that the original, well, not original, but the pastor who was the pastor when I was born retired, and he gave the congregation to his son. And that was around 1998, 1999. And at that point, not only were we kind of this kind of cult, we became a doomsday cult, or at least the church that I was in. We were constantly hearing about Columbine and children as murderers. We were constantly hearing about Y2K and the takeover of computers. And so we became a doomsday cult for a while. And then the doomsday didn't happen. And so at that point, a lot of people started to kind of be like, okay, maybe this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He wasn't as charismatic as his father was. He wasn't as commanding a presence as his father. So like once that happened, everybody was like, okay, maybe this guy doesn't know. So people started to filter out a little bit here and there. They would go to other related churches and things like that. And well, so my family stayed, and that happened in 2000. And then in 2001 was when 9/11 happened. And I remember personally being in school when that happened and asking a lot of questions. And then I went to church and I asked a lot of questions. And the answers that I got were drastically different.
And what kind of questions?
Questions like, well, why would they do that? How could they do that? What kind of people? Like, this was when I was saying earlier that my church got very, very racist in 2001 because the census in 2000 didn't have like Arab or North African, Middle Eastern, didn't have that as an option. So those people were put in the group of white people in the American census. And so our group got very, very upset about that. Like, they're calling these people all sorts of horrible names that I will not repeat. And I'm sitting here going, but one of my good friends at school is Muslim and she's fantastic. Like, she didn't do it.
Yeah.
The boy that I had a huge crush on at that time, he was Muslim. And I'm like, am I going to hell just for thinking about him? And it got to be very, very difficult for me to have questions and conversations at church because it would all get boiled up in, you're a woman, you shouldn't think, you should just do what you're told and marry somebody in the church and have babies. And I'm like, I don't like anybody in this church. They're all jerks. I know what's going to happen if I marry somebody in this church, and I don't like it. Because I had seen my older sisters. One of them got married at 14.
Wow.
And had a child with a man that was almost a decade older than her. And that relationship did not go well. And I didn't want that for myself.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I got to find a way to get somebody to understand that I don't want what they want for me. And I started asking questions, even more questions about like, well, why do we believe that women shouldn't wear pants? Like, just things like that.
That's a good question to me.
And, you know, why do we believe women shouldn't cut their hair? Because in the Bible, it doesn't say that women can't cut their hair. It actually says men can't cut their hair, you know, and I was one of those people that read the Bible cover to cover. And I have a friend who said that's the fastest way to make somebody an atheist is to read the Bible cover to cover.
I have heard that one before.
And for me, it was very true. When I sat down and read the entire thing, instead of hearing somebody cherry pick things from it and explain what those things meant, and I sat down and I read the whole thing, I was like, okay, they're not selling me all of the stuff in between. And so I made an appointment with the pastor to ask questions. And I asked my questions, and I got told, like I said, you're a woman. These are not things that you need to be worried about. You need to be focused on finishing high school and finding a husband and making a home. And I was like, I don't want that. I don't want to do any of that. And then finally he was just like, okay, you can go. We don't have anything else to talk about. And I said, okay. So I left. And when we came back to church the next Sunday, it was a situation where that particular pastor, it was the younger man. He had a habit of making his sermons about one particular person that week. He wouldn't name that person, but he would give enough detail so that you knew who that person was. And so he very much made it about me, and I knew. And at the end, he was like doing what they call the altar call, where you come down and ask for forgiveness. It's technically supposed to be asking forgiveness from God, but everybody knew you were asking forgiveness from the pastor. And I would not go. I was a stubborn teenage girl, and I would not go. And like everybody's looking at me like, would you please just, so he will stop, please just go up there. Just go. We know it's you. You know it's you. Just go. And I was like, I'm not going to do it. I will not. I will die sitting in this pew, and you will all die around me before I get up and go. And finally, he said my name, and I stood up and told him that he was an unholy man, and that I was not going to follow him to heaven. And if anybody in this congregation had any sense, they wouldn't follow him either. And I sat back down.
I bet he didn't like that.
He did not like that. And so we went to church multiple times a week. And on Sundays, we went twice a day. We went morning service and evening service. And this was something like everybody did. And we also all went to lunch in between, usually as a group together. When we went to lunch, I ate and I came back and I was like, okay, I'm just going to go back for evening service. They would not let me in the building.
And did your parents have anything to say about this incident?
By that time, my father was already out of the picture. He had softly been excommunicated, and he and my mother got divorced, which they were the first couple in the church to do so that I'm aware of. And so he was already out of the picture. My mother was furious. That was literally the first day of my life that she was very physically abusive to me, and I got physically abusive back to her. And it was terrifying and liberating at the same time, because every time I would say something, I would be told that I was breaking the commandment of honoring my mother. And so I was like, well, I'm going to go to hell. Today is the day.
Did you feel like you had nothing more to lose at that point? Were you just like, well, I'm done?
Yeah,
what else
pretty much.
Do I have?
Pretty much. That was when I was just so done. And there had been things that had led up to it. It seemed very quick, but looking back, I could see the trajectory. And I ended up going and staying with a friend of mine for a while. And her family was Catholic. So I stayed with them and went to Mass a few times. And I was like, okay, we have to go to Mass every time. It's beautiful. I love this. Because it was so drastically different from what we had. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was accusing you of anything. It was just some really cool singing, and there were cool smells. You had to do a little thing when you went in. It just all seemed really beautiful and amazing comparatively. And my friend calls herself an Easter Catholic. They went on Easter and Christmas, and that was about it. So she was like, no, you can go if you want to go, but we're not going to go every Sunday. So I started going a little bit more. And then I was like, what else is out there? And I explored every religion you could possibly think of, except for other cults for the most part.
And were you still a teenager, or were you an adult? How old were you?
I was still a teenager for a couple of years that I was doing that. And then I did it much into my adulthood. In my late 20s was when I finally was like, you know what? Maybe I'm an atheist.
But you explored all the major religions, basically.
Yes, I did. I explored all of the major religions. I've been to temples and mosques and synagogues, and there's even a Baha'i faith facility that's near us, and I went there. I went to the Satanic Temple when there was a Satanic Temple in Atlanta. That was where I felt the most at home.
Yeah. Well, they're just like atheists who are jerks about it and who are trolling the Christians. Yeah. That's my opinion of them.
Yes, that is very much them. Yes.
Yeah.
So I ended up going to Universalist church for a little while. It was very beautiful as well, but it was kind of too woo-woo for me. I was like, oh yeah, I like the idea of community, but do we have to have crystals involved? Yeah. No offense to anybody who likes crystals. They're beautiful rocks, and I do have some of them.
They look nice.
I do have some, but I don't believe that they can heal me or anything.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I guess I'm curious about like your family and living situation. So after this happened, did you have to basically move out? I imagine you weren't exactly welcome in your community at this point. Did you get a job? Like what happened?
Well, I had been working since I was 13 because I had to help pay the bills. When I went to stay with my friend, I eventually came back to stay with my mother for a time, and that was when I started getting custody of my younger siblings. By that time, I had started college, And that was the biggest no-no, especially for a girl in this group, was to start college. So I started college and I started learning, and I was like, this is not a healthy way of being.
Oh, your family life?
Yeah,
Yeah.
not just my family life, but like the whole environment that I grew up in, pretty much every
Yeah.
aspect of it was not a healthy way of being.
Yeah.
So I got myself out by getting an education and a job. And luckily, the person that I was dating at the time had a very kind family that let me stay with them after the situation with my family was resolved. But me and that spouse went on a journey together of deconstruction and deconversion. And then when that spouse transitioned, when we met in high school, we were high school sweethearts. They were identifying as a boy. And then after we got married and were together for a while, they started identifying as a woman. And then now they identify with gender neutral pronouns. And when we first were dating, I got called a race traitor because they are Asian. And then when we got married, a lot of my family didn't come to our wedding. I was okay with that. I didn't expect them to. And then when they transitioned, that was when I lost even more of my family because they refused to accept me being a lesbian or being perceived as a lesbian.
Yeah, I can imagine that homosexuality and transgender people were not welcome in your church as well.
No, it's not a very big leap, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they were not. Well, I should say we were not. I identify as bisexual. So yeah, no, we were not very welcomed at all in that space. And when I divorced my ex and married the man that I'm married to now, who my ex introduced me to, we got married. He happens to be white. And then we had a child together that obviously is also white. And when I had my son, that was when the church invited me back.
Oh, the one you grew up in. So they want you to
Yes.
come back now.
They wanted me to come back as kind of, it was like according to them, it was like an olive branch of, here, you've been away for a long time, but you seem to have found your way. You have a family, a white family. You
Oh.
know,
Oh.
this is yeah.
Oh.
So it seemed very, very important to my mother and her family. My father's family, still hadn't been talking to for a while at this point, but it seemed very important to my mother and her family. So I was like, okay, my husband, my son, and I will come for Easter service one day. We went, we come, everybody, oh, look at your beautiful family. Look at, nobody mentions the fact that we're white, but it's very obvious that it's like, you're with the white man now, not the Asian one. And it became very, very toxic. So I was like, yes, I was correct in staying away.
Yeah.
And so my husband and I said that we would not be going back to the church. Thank you for forgiving me, and I'm still working on forgiving them and that sort of thing.
I mean, do you feel like you have
But
to?
I don't feel like I have to forgive them as much as I feel like I have to forgive myself for the way that I was when I was there. Because I know, I see in other people how toxic it is and how it leads to hate and violence. And even just the small amount of rhetoric that I did fully take on and believe was harmful, not just to myself, but to other people.
So, what do you think about the state of the world now? Is it not surprising? And what's your perspective?
So, in college, I got a degree in anthropology, which is the study of people, because I've always been fascinated about how people become the way they are and why they do what they do. And so, when I was getting that degree, I was able to look back and see about myself and how I grew from what I started with. And then I started noticing it in other places, in other people. Like I could understand the dog whistles of the alt right begin to creep their way into a lot more mainstream places. And then I heard about QAnon and the lizard people. I heard about the overturning of Roe as one of the major Republican talking points. And I was like, I know this. I lived this. This is very familiar to me. And it sent me on a very negative spiral for a while, for a couple of years, of they are winning. They are actually going to do some of these crazy things, like starting a race war. They are going to come out and make literal people's bodies illegal. They're going to do a lot of these things. So it very much sent me down a negative path. And then I started learning more about the group that I left and the breadth of it, not just the depth, but also how far reaching it was, and realized that a lot of these things actually come from a lot of the places that I was afraid to look and afraid to speak about. And so, like, now I just want to be like, okay, look, it's there. Everybody knows it's there now. We are not being like, they're not being hush hush anymore. So why should I be quiet about it? Why should I stay quiet about the atrocities and the negativity and the horrible things that happened to me as a child living in a group like that that wants to make the whole world the way they are?
Yeah. From my perspective, I think it gives more humanity to the people who have been brought up with these ideas, because when you're brought up in something, you don't question it until you get old enough to. And so what do you do if you're just being raised with something? I mean, I'm glad you questioned. I'm glad you were the type of person who questioned and that you had access to outside information. Some people don't. And so you can see
Yeah.
how some people got to where they were, and it kind of makes you think a little harder when you ask, why did that person do that? Why are they that way? I mean, it doesn't excuse it, but it gives a little more explanation.
Right. And that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, is that so many of the people that believe in these things, it's all they've ever known. It wasn't a choice that they made. It wasn't just a rabbit hole on the internet. It was their entire life. It was their entire being. They don't even know to question it in a lot of cases. And so it's something that I was able to question and I was able to move on. But a lot of people aren't, and they're still there and they're doing what they think is best and what they think is right. But there hasn't been anybody to tell them there is another way of being outside of this that doesn't have to be what you believe is the enemy.
Yeah, it's just such a hard thing to talk about. People get defensive and upset. They worry you're going to say the wrong thing. So it's difficult.
Very much so.
Yeah, I have to ask though, I don't know how much memory you have of when you were in the depths of all of this, some of the things that are now conspiracy theories, the racism, the judgment, when you had embraced all of this. People always ask, like, why do people think these things? Like, this all sounds awful. Like, why? Why? Like, what about it felt good? Why were all these people in this group? Like, why did you embrace the beliefs? Why are people still in it?
I will say decades of therapy have helped me to realize a lot of these things. So it's not just me personally, it's a lot of work from spiritual abuse therapy and trauma survival therapy. So I can say one of the reasons is because they don't know any better. Another reason is that it feels fantastic to be told when you are, because we were a very poor community. It feels fantastic to be told that you are special and wonderful and that God has an extra special, even better place for you, made of literal streets of gold when you die. It is so difficult to describe the want of that, the need to have that when you are living in poverty. So that's a big draw of it. Another draw of it is that they're telling you how wonderful and great you are here on this earth compared to other people. You feel like you are the lowest of the low and that you're being walked on all the time. And you are, because you're living in poverty. But you're also being told, but you're still better. Even if it's only because of your skin color or your gender, you're still better than these people over here. And it makes you feel like you're one step up on the rung of the ladder compared to where you might feel otherwise. And I have a lot of guilt over feeling proud of being white or things like that. But I also realize that I don't have to be proud of being white. I can be proud of my Irish heritage. I can be proud of my ability to be me as an individual person rather than just the color of my skin and things like that. So for me, it comes with a lot of back and forth of whether it's positive or negative. But the positive things I can remember and I can see pretty clearly. I don't have like a lot of trauma blocks in those aspects of things as I do in others. But yeah, it's just very hush hush and nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, it's like igniting a fire, yeah, especially if you're on social media. Things just go
Right.
haywire. Well, you have some unique experiences. I don't know. Do you have any advice for anyone who's dealing with someone who has a differing opinion on whether it's like race or politics or, any of these hot button issues that everyone's screaming at each other about these days?
Right. Well, one of the big ones is don't tell them that they're wrong. You can believe that they are wrong all day, every day, but they think you're wrong. So if you sit there and tell them that they're wrong, they are going to dig in their heels and fight you on it. The easiest way to get somebody to assess or rethink a situation is to ask questions and get them asking questions, right? That's how I got out of all of this was I asked a lot of questions. You have to be curious and you have to be courteous and not just be like, well, you're a bigot or a racist or a sexist or, whatever. You have to say, oh, I never thought about it that way. Could you explain it? And just get curious. And it may sound like the most disgusting, vile thing, but it also is giving an open door and an open dialogue and a way of back and forth that you won't have if you just say, you are this way. Because if you say that to them, they're going to say it back to you and there's going to be a closed door and no communication is going to happen.
Yeah. You're putting someone in a category and then it's just done and moving on, and nobody likes that. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I mean, what it all comes down to is like these things take patience, and a lot of us just don't have it.
That is very true. I find myself not having a lot of patience at times.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for being willing to talk to me about these things. Is there anything else regarding this topic or your own experiences that you would like to discuss?
One of the things that I wanted to touch on that I hadn't really gotten a chance was the place that they have a tendency to put girls and women, which is just a place of subjugation. And I know so many girls and women who have gotten out of this cult or similar cults have a really hard time finding their voice and their place. And there are people out there that are willing to help. There are people out there that are willing to listen, and you can't be afraid to look for those people. You can't be afraid that everyone is going to treat you the way you're used to being treated. That's just one of the big things that I am very passionate about, is because girls and women in these groups are silenced so much to the point of literally when they speak, they sound like children. Or when they get angry, instead of getting angry, they'll turn it inward and they'll cry. Or not that crying is bad, but they turn it into something else because women aren't supposed to feel anger in these groups. And so just having a voice and letting yourself be known and heard is so important when you're leaving a group like this, especially if you're a woman.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for having me and listening to my story.
Thank you for sharing your story and for coming on. It was fascinating.